I really am tremendously honored by this, actually. I can't tell you how moved I am. It is quite true that Edith Wharton has been a tremendous influence on me and on my writing, although actually she came quite late into my life. I studied English at Magdalen College, Cambridge, and as it happens, the head of the department there, John Stevens, didn't really believe that anything worth reading had been written after 1600. I wasn't interested in much that was written before 1800, so we missed each other by 2 centuries. But Wharton was not much taught then. Henry James, yes, but she hadn't really been discovered by the English at that point. I mean, of course, earlier, during her own career, tremendously. But she had gone into the background, from which I'm happy to say she has now emerged. Eventually, I think I was in my 30s when someone gave me a copy of the House of Mirth. And I was instantly impressed by the extraordinarily contemporary feeling of this woman's writing. Her dialogue was so immediate, her understanding of emotional predicaments was so vital. She does not judge. She observes, but she does not judge. Even Lily Bart, trapped in her gilded cage, surrounded by false values pulling at her, Wharton has a kind of sympathy that carries you through. Although The House of Mirth is probably her darkest novel, because it was written at her darkest time. Then I moved on from Lily Bart to The Custom of the Country, and it is quite true that I felt this was my book. This was talking to me in a most extreme and immediate way. I think it's a remarkable piece of writing. I mean, in Undine Spragg, Wharton has created an anti-heroine absolutely in the same rank as Becky Sharp or Scarlett O'Hara or Lizzie Eustace or any of them. These curious, amoral women who have no values except ambition and desire. And yet, through the miracle of her writing, you're sort of on their side. That's what's so extraordinary about the book. Undine ruins lives. Her first husband kills himself. The second one is ruined. And yet, in some funny way, we're quite glad she comes out on top. That is Wharton, with this extraordinary warmth and wit that is woven into the truth of her observation. I particularly like this sentence, which comes very, very near the end of the novel. And Undine is then married to Elmer Moffat, who is as rich as Croesus, and everything is sort of marvelous. Even now, however, she was not always happy. She had everything she wanted, but she still felt at times that there were other things she might want if she knew about them. Yesterday, I went to the Mount, a tremendously beguiling and beautiful place. I would urge any of you who haven't seen it to go and make it an outing and stay at the Blantyre and do the whole thing, because one thing you don't really get from the photographs of the Mount is its charm. It looks very beautiful. It looks very impressive, actually. In photographs, it almost looks like one of those sort of Newport cottages trumpeting its own importance. But that is not what it is. When you get there, you find this really delightful, beautifully proportioned, very mellow, very brilliantly thought out house, which, it sounds an odd word to use, but has a sort of modesty to it. And you understand Edith Wharton's own dream. There is an irony there, but actually before I say that, I just want to congratulate all of you here who have brought the Mount back from the dead. I mean, this really was the greatest resurrection since Lazarus, and I cannot praise all of you enough. Of course, it has an irony to it, because she built it in 1902, and she lived there for 9 years until 1911. And these were unquestionably the most unhappy years of her entire life. That is the sort of sorrow that lies underneath it as a base note. In 1897, before she got to the Mount, she published her first book. She'd been married to Edith Wharton for 12 years. There were no children, but they were happy. They traveled all over the place. She adored him. And everything was lovely, and her book was about interior decoration. And that was very lovely. But by the time she got to the Mount, she realized that her husband had been claimed by depression, which was moving towards some kind of pre-senile dementia. And she was in that stage of when she knew that at some point it must come to an end, but she had not yet found the courage, not just to break with him, because she loved him. She loved him at the very end of his life. He died in the 20s, and she wrote to someone and said, of course, our Teddy died years before, which is always so sad. It's like Alzheimer's, when the real person is taken from you, even though they're still walking and talking. And she had to live through that. And out of that, in 1905, came the House of Mirth. And she doesn't, again, I've said she doesn't judge. The extraordinary thing about the House of Mirth is she sort of pities Lily for being taken in by these rituals and these customs. She pities Lily for being manipulated by money, because all of those books in one level or other are about money and its power over us. And she is sorry for Lily as she goes on down the hill. And of course, Edith Wharton is writing about what she knew. She was pretending. She was living in society, putting forward the couple, happily married Whartons and all of this, when she knew it was a lie. At the beginning, I think she hoped he would come through it, but by this point, she knew he wouldn't. She had left Newport. She loved Newport as a girl, you know, and as a young woman, she enjoyed it, but by now she hated it. And I think she hated the constantly prying eyes when she was living this terrible marriage. And so then she goes to the Mount, thinking maybe somehow to get away from all of that, to be alone in their own environment. It could be made to work, but of course it could not. She left Teddy at last in 1911, whereupon he sold the house, lock, stock and barrel, with all its contents, without telling her. And that was his final blow. But by 1913, when she wrote Custom of the Country, she's left America, she's gone to France, she's made a new life, and she would continue to chronicle the ways of old New York for the rest of her writing career, but she would not live there. She made a new life. She came back to America to collect an award, but only once. Apart from that, the rest of her life was spent in Europe. And she lived a good, productive life in France. She became a very respected figure. She got the Légion d'honneur for her work in the First World War. And I think she found a kind of fulfillment, certainly, but also a kind of happiness. So that by the time she writes Age of Innocence in 1921, she is gentler with this world and its false values. She said herself, actually, that one of her reasons for writing it was to redress the balance after the severity of House of Mirth. And I think that this was what I find tremendously inspiring, was this ability to judge without feeling the need to condemn, to find humor in it as well as being severe. She allows the old ways their strengths, even while she criticizes their power. All of this was a tremendous inspiration to me. I decided, largely because of her work, that it was time I wrote something, and because of Edith Wharton, the old thing, write what you know, I decided to write what I knew, not to try and find some kind of more interesting story than my own, but to write about my own story and my own world and the world I'd grown up in and so on. And the result was Snobs, a novel. Actually, having finished it, I was quite unable to find a publisher. I couldn't get a publisher to read it, actually. Even if I'd pinned £50 notes between the pages, they wouldn't read it. But nevertheless, I had begun. And I started after that to work on scripts, again, unpaid and unmade, but nevertheless, one of them that I worked on was for an actor-producer called Bob Balaban, and a little while later, he got in touch with me and asked if I would be interested in writing a film about an English country house in the 1930s. Sorry about my water habit. Of course, the 1930s was not the world that I'd known, but I did know of it. I knew of it firsthand because I am 100, and so my great aunts and things were born at the end of the 1870s, in 1880 and so on, and my main great aunt, on whom Violet Grantham and others are modelled, I knew well. She only died when I was 21, so I had heard a lot about the world between the wars and so on. I was lucky that I was interested when I was young. So often you get interested and everyone's dead. But that didn't happen to me. And so I did know about it. And the end product was a film called Gosford Park, written for Robert Altman. And you know, it was, in a way, it was a more bitter vision than some of my later stuff. I suppose I could say it was my House of Mirth, but anyway, the picture was a hit. And I won an Oscar for it, and if the rest, oh, you're very kind. The rest, if not history anyway, altered my history. And among the doors that opened was a letter from Weidenfeld asking if I would care to publish a novel. This does not happen to many, and I knew that. Anyway, I took the crumpled, tattered manuscript from my bottom drawer, and Snobs was reborn. Actually, in fact, I had had a real struggle before, and at one point I showed it to quite a senior literary agent in London, and he gave it back to me saying, and I quote, "My advice is to put this in the dustbin and write something grown up." I cannot tell you the pleasure I have now whenever I see him, updating him on how many countries it's been a bestseller. I think we've got to about 27. Anyway, the following decade was a very lucky one for me, actually. I think I was very blessed. Mary Poppins is in its 6th year on Broadway, and Young Victoria I was very pleased with, and another novel, Past Imperfect, did well, and Separate Lives. Actually, Separate Lives, which is a contemporary tale of the sort of prosperous bourgeoisie, is probably my own personal favorite, which is odd, really, that since I'm sort of known for period stuff. But anyway, all of these took me to the warm, safe shores of Downton Abbey. I'm often asked whether the characters and incidents in Downton are based on real people. Of course they often are, even if I'm a bit chary of identifying them. Ever since I told a great friend, an early patroness of mine and an encourager of my youth, that she was the model for the Marchioness of Uckfield in Snobs, I thought she'd be enormously amused. I was quite wrong, and she didn't speak to me for 2 years. So, however, some of them are absolutely true to life, not least, which may hopefully interest you, the fate of the Turk, Kamal Pamuk. This is actually based on a story which I heard years ago from a cousin of Emma's who had a great house, quite a famous one that you'd all know, and he'd come across a diary of a great aunt. And in it, she had recounted the story. In the 1890s, there'd been a house party, and in this house, lots of houses had bachelor corridors, but this house had a particular passage of bedrooms that was only for single women, young girls, spinsters, widows, you know. And anyway, one of them had smuggled a man up into her room. where he died of a heart attack in her bed. And of course, she was completely mortified, didn't know what to do, and eventually, sort of faute de mieux, knocked on the next door bedroom. And there, this sort of blameless matron listened to this horrible story. But she realized that if it got out, they would all be engulfed in a scandal of such proportion that it would never be forgotten. So they woke up the other women along this passage, and this gaggle of debutantes and dowagers carried the dead body of this diplomat the full length of the house and got him back into the right bed. And the miracle is that he then looked up the diary of his great-grandfather, and for this particular Saturday to Monday, the great-grandfather had written, such a shame, nice Mr. Thing, was found dead in his bed by his valet. So clearly, these women got away with it. And as I was listening to it, I thought, one day that will come in handy. And the day dawned. But if they are all or mostly true, I hope I have learnt Edith Wharton's lesson and added mercy into the mix. I also seek to criticize, but I do not wish to condemn. Actually, now I think of it, I don't think I have been all that kind to O'Brien, who is pretty unrelenting in her nastiness, the lady's maid. Actually, she is completely based on a true character of my own youth, and this was the sort of housekeeper companion of an old cousin of ours. And this particular woman, who was perfectly horrible, had graduated. She'd come as a lady's maid, and then when all the other servants had left, she'd stayed on and eventually become sort of housekeeper stroke controller. And her sole motive was to keep all family and friends away from her victim. So our job was to try and get past this sort of Cerberus figure and run up to the drawing room before she could stop us. So in a way, I do feel pretty merciless towards her. But I wouldn't say the same for Thomas the Footman, who is the other sort of villain of the series. To me, he is rather redeemed by being gay, in the sense that that situation at that time was one of a very cruel injustice. For many, many men and women in that period, well, not women actually, because it was never illegal for women, but for men, a misjudged encounter could lead to a charge, could lead to prison. And so all the time, you were on the edge of disaster. And for me, that gives Thomas an excuse for his defensive rage, because the world is so hard on him. And so, I'm always sort of slightly on his side, really. But anyway, it's quite true and obvious that the Downton experience has been an extraordinary one. I mean, it's the kind of thing that happens once in your career if you're incredibly lucky. And I feel I have been incredibly lucky. People say, why do you think it's happened? Why is it so popular? I don't know. I think it's a great show, and I absolutely love the fact that people love it. But if I knew why, I would never write anything but enormous hits for the rest of my life. But I think the point is that, as I've said, really, while I do intend to be critical of the inequities of that world, of the casual sense of entitlement enjoyed by the privileged classes, of the relentless submersion of those below stairs, where their lives were always of secondary importance compared to those of their employers. There's a line actually in Gosford Park where the little maid says to Helen Mirren, the housekeeper, "But what about you? What about your life?" And Helen Mirren says, "Didn't you hear me? I'm the perfect servant. I have no life." And I think that was the price they pay. But with all this, I hope I am kind. I hope it is a warm show, and I hope I am kind to them in their weakness and kind to them in the error of their ways. And if I am, I do feel it is a lesson I have learnt directly from the writing of Edith Wharton, from her tolerance and her wit and her humor, even while she wields the rod. And consequently, I consider myself both grateful and blessed in having made her acquaintance. Thank you very much. Oh my goodness.